Wasilla is not the sort of place outsiders usually choose as the emblem of modern environmental policy. It is better known for commerce, snow, big box retail, and a politics that tends to distrust small government interventions. And that is exactly why its plastic bag ban mattered. The question was never only whether litter was ugly, it was how a conservative Alaska city decided that one disposable object had become everyone's problem. To understand the ban, you have to begin with local identity. Wasilla sits in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, where independence is a civic reflex and convenience is rarely an abstract luxury. When city leaders took up plastic bags in 2017 and 2018, they were stepping into a place where even modest rules could feel like philosophical statements. The ordinance that emerged was shaped as much by that political culture as by the bags themselves. Advocates kept returning to the same practical point. In the Matsu, wind turns disposal into movement. A thin plastic bag that escapes a cart, a dumpster, or a transfer station does not stay put. It skitters down roads, lifts into ditches, and catches in spruce and birch where everybody can see it. In the local telling, this was not a distant climate debate. It was a visible failure of stewardship. That framing mattered because the valley sells a version of Alaska to itself and to visitors: clean air, wide sky, mountains, water, and room. Supporters argued that the sight of synthetic litter cutting across that landscape made the cost of the bags newly obvious. Even people who were not ready to embrace a ban could understand the embarrassment of trash that would not stay buried. The case against thin plastic bags was not simply that they existed, it was that local systems seemed poorly matched to them. In public argument, the bag became a special kind of nuisance, light enough to escape, durable enough to linger, and visible enough to turn ordinary cleanup failure into a civic irritant. The campaign itself was not born entirely inside Wasilla. It grew out of regional organizing, especially around the Matsu Zero Waste Coalition and its Plastic Bag Committee. Volunteers tried to normalize change before the law ever arrived, handing out reusable bags and speaking in the plain language of cleanup, wildlife, and common sense. Their bet was that public habit had to shift before public policy could last. One of the most persistent voices was Carol Montgomery of Palmer. In letters and testimony, she argued that thin plastic bags were a special kind of nuisance because they were cheap, light, durable, and hard to contain once wind got hold of them. She also pushed against half measures, warning lawmakers that a bag labeled reusable could still behave like single-use plastic if it was handed out for free and discarded just as fast. Then the argument moved from scenery to stomachs. In Alaska, wildlife is not a generic environmental symbol. It is food, economy, memory, identity, and a daily presence. When advocates said moose, caribou, reindeer, seabirds, and marine animals could be harmed by plastic, they were not asking the public to care about some distant species. They were talking about animals Alaskans already understood as part of home. The most arresting evidence came through Bill Collins at the Palmer Experiment Farm. Collins maintained moose with research access to the rumen, the first stomach, and in coalition materials he is shown dumping out contents that included plastic bags. He was careful about the claim. The plastic might not kill immediately, but it occupied space where nutrition should go. That caution made the evidence more powerful, not less. Beyond moose, the evidence broadened into a mixed record of direct observation, scientific concern, and advocacy testimony. Supporters cited reindeer and caribou losses, seabird ingestion, marine debris, and the way plastic fragments break down into smaller pieces without truly disappearing. Some of those claims were tighter than others, and the honest version of this story has to say that plainly. But together, they change the emotional center of the debate. Bags were no longer only messy, they could be biologically consequential. By late 2017, the question in Wasilla was no longer whether plastic bags were annoying. It was who had the right to do something about them. That is where this story becomes distinctly Alaskan, less a showdown between industry and activists than a local argument about the proper reach of government. Mayor Burt Cottle helped define that choice by rejecting a fee or tax frame. Public reporting from the period shows him arguing that if government intervened at all, it should do so cleanly, rather than creating what residents would experience as another surcharge. That anti-tax logic gave the ordinance a strange political advantage. The bag ban could be pitched not as a new burden, but as a cleaner alternative to one. The public record shows a slow municipal process: introduction, hearings, carried testimony, and long lists of people speaking for and against the ordinance. In the January 8, 2018 minutes, Carol Montgomery appears among the supporters before the final vote. That matters because it shows how the Valley campaign translated itself into city procedure. The ban was not dropped from above. It was worked into existence in public. The dissenter, Council Member Tim Burney, has to be understood on his own terms. He was not arguing that litter looked good. He was arguing that the relationship between a store and its customers did not belong to City Hall. In that frame, every modest restriction becomes a precedent, and every precedent becomes a test of how much freedom a town is willing to trade for cleanliness. The ordinance passed 5-1. The recorded no belongs to Burney, and the law that emerges is Wasilla Ordinance 1724. That single page carries the hinge of the whole documentary. A city known for distrusting small intrusions decided by a clear council majority that thin plastic bags had become a legitimate municipal problem. The text of the ordinance explains both its appeal and its future weakness. It set a July 1st, 2018 effective date, created an enforcement ladder of warning, then $100, then $300, and banned thin single-use plastic bags. But it also left room for paper, reusable bags, and plastic bags at or above 2.25 mils. That thickness threshold would later become the law's most controversial compromise. Passing a ban is one thing. Living inside its design is another. When July arrived, the Wasilla bag ban entered the part of policy that legal text always understates. Checkout counters, supply chains, habit, irritation, and the second-order effects nobody can fully model in advance. Early coverage and council discussion show that the rollout was real, visible, and surprisingly orderly. Shoppers encountered paper bags, reusable alternatives, and the immediate fact that some substitutes cost more than the old thin plastic. For families that reused grocery bags as trash liners or pet waste bags, the change felt less like symbolism and more like a direct tax on routine. That friction was never imaginary. No example carried the design critique better than Wasilla Walmart. In later criticism, the store became a case study in unintended consequences: thicker bags, more shipping space, more plastic by weight, and little confidence that customers were actually reusing them enough to justify the switch. For opponents of the ban, Walmart did not disprove the litter problem. It suggested the solution might be poorly engineered. Even so, the first municipal check-ins were not framed as failure. The July 9, 2018 council record shows members discussing the rule after it took effect and speaking approvingly about the visible transition. That tone matters because it captures a truth that critics and supporters both had to live with. The ban was working in some ways. At exactly the same moment, it was revealing new problems. The same meeting also records the deeper critique. Bernie and others raised concern about thicker plastic bags, visitor burden, and regulations that seemed to improve appearances while potentially worsening material use. This is the documentary's central complication, and it has to stay intact. If the story only celebrates wasilla, it misses the design flaw. If it only mocks the ban, it misses the visible litter reduction people kept describing. What the ordinance really did was shift the public from one convenience ecology to another. Paper, reusable fabric, thick plastic, personal habit, retailer discretion, and local interpretation all began competing in the same checkout space. The question was no longer whether the town could eliminate inconvenience. It was which inconvenience it preferred and which unintended cost it could live with. Wasilla's importance was never that it solved plastic. Its importance was that it produced a precedent. Once one conservative Alaska city had acted, other communities and lawmakers could stop talking in hypotheticals. They had a case, a vote, a timeline, and a local experiment to point to. Anchorage took that lesson and moved further. By the time its assembly acted, Wasilla had already provided a recent model of both benefits and pitfalls. Anchorage's version was stricter, especially around plastic, and later pandemic years would complicate its enforcement. But the historical point is simpler. Wasilla made it easier for bigger places to imagine acting. Carol Montgomery carried the argument into state testimony by presenting local bans as evidence of a growing Alaska-wide appetite for change. Her written statements are blunt about the loophole problem. If thicker bags are free, she argued, then the policy can undermine itself. That combination of grassroots urgency and design critique made her a more serious witness than either side's caricature of an activist. In Juneau, the debate kept the same moral vocabulary it had in Wasilla. Supporters spoke about wildlife, beauty, cleanup, and public habit. Opponents warned about liberty, precedent, and the danger of using law to answer every small social problem. What changed was scale. Once the question reached the legislature, local nuisance became an Alaska governance argument, and Wasilla was not alone for long. Anchorage, Bethel, Cordova, Unalaska, Kodiak, Soldotna, and others each developed their own versions, thresholds, and fee structures. The state never settled on one uniform rule. That patchwork is part of the story too. The ban spread as a family of local experiments, not as a single clean Alaska solution. Years later, the ordinance's afterlife becomes harder to narrate because the evidence gets thinner and more human. The sources shift away from dramatic legislative fights and toward remarks, impressions, maintenance, and the uneasy difference between a law that exists and a law that is actively enforced. In February 2019, Bernie, still the philosophical opponent, comments that he has noticed a significant decline in plastic bags. That does not settle the policy case. It does something more interesting. It shows a critic conceding a visible effect while still leaving the liberty argument standing. That kind of record is messy, which is exactly why it feels trustworthy. The pandemic interrupted the entire subject. In Anchorage and elsewhere, public health concern, supply disruption, and fear about reusable surfaces changed how bag rules were treated. This was not a Wasilla-specific phenomenon, but it altered the public meaning of bag policy across Alaska. Suddenly, the objects at the center of the debate were being judged through contamination, not litter. That moment also exposed how fragile public habit can be. A years-long argument about waste was briefly displaced by a different argument about touch, surfaces, and emergency retail logic. When the health rationales softened, some bans returned. But the interruption mattered because it reminded everyone that even an ordinance with moral force can be suspended when a new crisis changes what people fear most. The Wasilla record eventually includes an attempted repeal and, more strikingly, a staff memo stating that the chapter was not being enforced. That single line turns the story away from clean victory narratives. A ban can stay on the books, shape behavior, influence other cities, and still drift into administrative ambiguity. Law on paper and law in action are not the same thing, and yet the logic that powered the bag fight did not disappear. It migrated. The state moved on to another material with eerily familiar qualities: light, persistent, hard to recover once loose, and newly difficult to defend in public. House Bill 354, aimed at polystyrene foam, carried forward the same structure of argument: pollution, retrieval difficulty, long-term health, and ecosystem risk, and the challenge of making remote businesses change under real economic constraint. The bill did not pass. But failure in committee does not mean the story ended. It means the Wasilla pattern repeated. Local experience first, statewide consensus later, if later comes at all. That is the long tail of the Wasilla precedent. Not a straight line of success, and certainly not a perfect template. Instead, it is a civic example that keeps reappearing whenever Alaska argues about disposable convenience, visible waste, and how much government should do to force a new habit. In the end, the strongest image remains the simplest one: a bag caught in a tree when nobody wanted it. It is not scientific enough to settle every policy question on its own, but it is vivid enough to change what counts as normal. Once a community starts seeing that image as unacceptable rather than inevitable, politics begins to move. Wasilla did not solve plastic. It did something messier and maybe more durable. It showed that even in a place wary of regulation, a small object could become a public argument about responsibility, landscape, and the limits of private convenience. The law it produced was imperfect. The precedent it created was real. And in Alaska, that may be the part that lasts.